Most parents would have lost everything that day. Not slowly, not over time, in one sentence. She waited until the priest finished speaking, until the last hymn faded, until the lid on my son's coffin was still open, like the world hadn't quite accepted what had happened yet. Then she leaned toward me and screamed, "You have 7 days to get out of my house, old man." Not whispered, not private, loud enough that people turned, loud enough that the men holding umbrellas stopped adjusting their grips, loud enough that I felt eyes crawl across my back like insects. If you've never been humiliated in public, you don't understand how fast your body reacts before your mind does. My chest tightened, my hearing went dull. The cold October air felt suddenly thin, like it didn't have enough oxygen left in it. She wasn't crying. That's what stuck with me. Everyone else had red eyes, shaking hands, faces pinched with grief. But her face was sharp, focused, almost relieved. I didn't answer her. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled. "You're not family anymore. You were only here because he let you be." She nodded toward the casket. "He's gone." That's when I noticed something else. Some people weren't shocked. A few looked uncomfortable, yes, but a few others. They avoided my eyes, shifted their weight. One man actually nodded, just slightly, like he agreed. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't just grief talking. This wasn't sudden madness. This had been rehearsed. If you're still watching this, ask yourself something, and don't answer out loud yet. What would you have done? Argued? Begged? Explained? Most people would have tried to defend themselves. I didn't. I looked at her, really looked, and I smiled. Not wide, not smug, just enough. That confused her. Confusion makes people angry, and anger makes them careless. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way her hand curled into a fist at her side. 7 A's, she repeated. "I want you gone." I nodded. "All right," I said. That was it. No shouting, no scene, no explanation. If you're wondering why I didn't fight back, you're asking the wrong question. The better question is this. Why did she think she could say that at all? Because here's what most people didn't know, what she didn't know. I wasn't standing there empty-handed. I just wasn't holding anything you could see. The service ended not long after that. People drifted away in clusters, whispering. Some avoided me completely. A few offered polite, hollow condolences, the kind you give when you don't want to be involved. I stayed until the cemetery emptied. I watched them lower my son into the ground. I stayed until the workers started packing up chairs, until the silence returned. Then I went back to the house. Yes, that house. The one she'd just called hers. I walked through it slowly, not like a man being evicted, like a man counting. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The living room still had the throw blanket my wife used before she passed. The hallway light flickered the same way it always had. I didn't pack much. That's another thing people misunderstand about moments like this. They think grief makes you cling. Sometimes it does the opposite. I packed one suitcase, clothes, a few photographs, my watch, and one thin folder from a place no one ever looks at unless they know exactly where to reach. I left the rest. At the kitchen counter, I placed the keys neatly beside each other. Front door, garage, shed. I didn't leave a note. I checked into a small hotel off the interstate, the kind of place with beige walls and humming air units. The clerk didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. I slept for 4 hours. At 5:42 a.m., my alarm went off. I didn't turn it off right away. I lay there listening to the hum of the heater, counting my breaths. If you've ever been in a situation where timing matters, you know this feeling. The waiting isn't nervousness, it's control. At 6:01 a.m., my phone buzzed. Not a call, a notification. If stories like this unsettle you, there's a reason. Most people don't know how close they are to losing things they assume are untouchable. Stay close. You'll want to see how this unfolds. I turned on the television. Live footage. Police vehicles lined the street in front of the house. 2 cruisers, 1 unmarked SUV. Officers on the lawn. My lawn. One of them knocked. No answer. He knocked again. The camera zoomed in just as the front door opened. Her face appeared on screen, still half asleep, wrapped in a robe that cost more than my first car. Her expression shifted. Confusion. Annoyance. Then something else. Fear. I took a sip of the lukewarm hotel coffee. This wasn't the moment everything ended. This was the moment something much bigger started. Because the police weren't there for what she thought they were there for. And the house? The house was just the first layer. If you think this is where the story peaks, you're mistaken. What came next pulled in lawyers, records, and questions no one wanted asked, especially not about my son. And that's where this gets uncomfortable. Some people will say what happened next was justified. Others will say it went too far. I didn't destroy anyone. I stopped standing in the way. And if you're already forming an opinion, hold it. Because you don't yet know what my son knew before he died. The thing that bothered me most about the funeral wasn't what she said. It was who didn't object. When I left the cemetery, that detail followed me like a shadow. Faces, small gestures, averted eyes, the man who nodded. You don't notice those things unless you've lived long enough to understand what silence means. Silence is rarely neutral. Back at the house, before it stopped being mine, I moved through each room with that thought pressing against the back of my skull. Not angry, not confused, calculating. People don't side with cruelty unless they've been fed a story first, and I had a feeling I knew which story they'd been given. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that afternoon, the same table where I used to help my grandchildren with homework, the same spot where my son once sat across from me, elbows on the wood, asking how to fix a leaky faucet because he didn't want to call a plumber. That memory came back uninvited. So did another. About 6 months earlier, I'd overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear, not because it was whispered, but because it happened when she assumed I was gone. I'd been in the garage, reorganizing shelves. She was on the phone in the living room, pacing. "I'm not saying kick him out tomorrow," she said, "but it's not normal. People will ask questions." I remember freezing, not because of the words, because of the tone. Measured, strategic, like someone planning a renovation, not talking about a person. Later, when I stepped inside, she smiled at me, asked if I wanted dinner, normal as could be. I told myself I was imagining things. That's what decent people do. We give others the benefit of the doubt until it costs us. If you've ever ignored a warning sign because you didn't want conflict, you already know where this goes. Over the next few months, small things changed. Mail stopped arriving with my name on it. Utility bills were redirected. Contractors came by and spoke only to her, even when I was standing there. Once, a man in a suit asked if I was visiting. I corrected him. He didn't apologize. That should have told me everything. But I stayed quiet. Part of it was grief. Losing my wife had left me hollow in places I didn't know how to fill. Living near my son and his family felt like continuity, like I still belonged somewhere. Another part was pride. I didn't want to be the old man causing trouble in his son's house. And yes, his house. That's what I thought then. The day my son asked to meet me alone, I almost canceled. He sounded tired on the phone. Not sick, not weak, just worn down. We met at a diner halfway between his office and the house, one of those places that smells like coffee no matter the hour, vinyl booths, worn menus. He didn't order right away. He just looked at me. "People talk," he said. "About what?" "About us. About you living with us." I shrugged. People always talk. He nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the table. "They think it's temporary," he said, "that you're transitioning." That word again. I asked him what he meant. He hesitated, then said, "She's been telling them you're planning to move soon." That was the first time he admitted it out loud. I didn't react, I didn't argue, I just waited. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice even though the diner was loud. "You need to promise me something," he said. "What?" "No matter what happens, don't argue with her." That caught my attention. Why would I argue with her? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket and touched the inside pocket, like he was checking for something. "Just promise me," he said. I did. I wish I could tell you why in that moment. I didn't. When he died weeks later, that conversation replayed itself over and over, different angles, different emphasis, especially after the funeral, especially after I saw who nodded. You see, once someone paints you as a burden, it doesn't take much to convince others you don't belong. All it takes is repetition, tone, a few carefully chosen words. He's old. He doesn't contribute. He's just there. That's how people justify erasing you. If this makes you uncomfortable, it should, because it happens quietly every day to people who assume love equals safety. And here's the part no one talks about. Once people decide you're in the way, your removal feels reasonable to them. That's what I saw at the funeral. Not shock, acceptance. I packed that night with those faces in mind, not out of fear, but clarity. Because arguing would have done exactly what she wanted. It would have made me look unstable. Instead, I left. And while she slept, thinking she'd won, something she'd been building for months started to unravel. If you're still watching, understand this. Most people don't lose their homes in dramatic courtrooms or screaming matches. They lose them in conversations they never hear. And if you think this story is about property, you're missing the real danger. The danger is what my son suspected before he died. The danger is why he told me not to argue. The danger is why the police already knew where to go that morning. If you want to stay ahead of situations like this, you already know why people follow stories like mine. Some lessons are expensive to learn firsthand. In the next chapter, I'll explain the one sentence my son said that changed how I see everything that came after. And once you hear it, you'll understand why the house was never the real target. There's a sentence my son said that day in the diner that didn't make sense to me at the time. It didn't sound dramatic. It didn't sound urgent. That's why it stayed buried. We were halfway through our coffee when he said it. He'd already asked me not to argue. I had already promised. There was a long pause where neither of us spoke, just the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversations around us. Then he said, almost casually, "If anyone ever tells you to leave, don't fight it." I remember smiling at him. "Why would anyone tell me to leave?" I asked. He didn't smile back. Instead, he looked past me, toward the window, toward the parking lot, toward nothing in particular. "Because," he said, "sometimes leaving is safer than staying." That was it. No explanation, no follow-up. I didn't push. That's something age teaches you. When someone avoids a subject twice, they're not being forgetful. They're protecting you, or themselves. At the time, I assumed stress, work, marriage, the weight of responsibilities I'd never fully seen from the outside. Now, looking back, I realized something much harder to accept. He wasn't worried about me being hurt. He was worried about me being trapped. That understanding didn't come all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, after the funeral, after the shouting, after the nods, after I left the house quietly in the dark. The hotel room was still when I woke up before dawn. No traffic, no voices in the hallway, just the low click of the heater cycling on and off. I sat on the edge of the bed and replayed that diner conversation again. Don't fight it. Leaving is safer than staying. At the time, I thought he meant emotionally. Pride, dignity. I was wrong. Because emotional safety doesn't require police. I turned on the television just before 6, not because I expected anything, but because something in my chest felt tight in a way I didn't recognize. That's when I saw the patrol cars. By the time the knock came on the door on screen, my phone was already buzzing again. This time, a message, not from her, from a number I didn't recognize. Sir, please remain available this morning. No signature, no explanation. If that doesn't make your skin crawl, it should. People assume power announces itself, that it comes with threats, raised voices, deadlines. Real power moves quietly, and my son knew that. After the officers entered the house, after the cameras cut away, I turned the television off. I didn't need to see more. Instead, I reached into my suitcase and pulled out the folder I'd taken from the house, the one I hadn't opened yet. That wasn't an accident. Some truths change you once you read them. I wanted to be steady before I did. Inside were documents I recognized, and ones I didn't. The deed, the trust, amendments dated far more recently than I'd expected. My son's handwriting filled the margins in places, notes, arrows, cross-references. This wasn't drafted in a rush. This was something built, carefully. The first thing that hit me wasn't relief, it was dread. Because you don't build something this layered unless you're preparing for resistance or exposure. The trust didn't just control the house. That was the smallest part. It outlined contingencies, conditions, automatic responses triggered by specific actions, including attempts to remove me, including verbal eviction, including documented threats. And here's the part that made my hands shake just enough that I had to set the papers down. Some of the clauses weren't civil. They referenced reporting requirements, mandatory notifications, language you don't use unless other systems are already involved. If you're still watching, pause for a second and think about this. Why would a man in his 40s, healthy, active, meticulous, structure his affairs like he was anticipating a collapse? That question haunted me more than the funeral ever did. I flipped to the last page. There was a single paragraph highlighted in yellow. A note beside it, written in the same careful handwriting I recognized from birthday cards and old letters. If this triggers, Dad leaves immediately. No confrontation. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not anger, understanding. My son didn't tell me everything because he couldn't, or because he was afraid, or because he thought he had more time. He told me just enough to keep me alive. Because whatever he suspected, whatever he saw coming, it wasn't something he believed could be talked away. It had to be documented, triggered, handled by people with badges and authority, not raised voices and arguments. And the most unsettling part? The clause had already been activated. Not when the police arrived, not when she tried to change the locks. It activated the moment she threatened me at the funeral, loud enough, in public, with witnesses. She didn't just humiliate me, she flipped a switch. If this story feels less like revenge now and more like something else, you're starting to see it clearly. This isn't about an old man outsmarting a cruel woman. It's about what happens when someone underestimates how much has already been set in motion. In the next chapter, I'll explain why I didn't stay to watch the police take her away, and why I crossed state lines before noon. Because by then, it wasn't just about a house. It was about whether I was the next problem that needed to be removed. And that's a question you never want answered too late. If you think you'd recognize danger when it looks polite and organized, stay with me. Most people don't. I didn't stay to watch her get escorted out. That surprises people when they hear it. They expect satisfaction, closure, a front row seat to justice. But I wasn't interested in watching her fall apart. By the time the police knocked on that door, I already understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. When systems activate, they don't stop at the person you think they're aimed at. They keep going until everything connected is examined, including you. I packed the folder back into my suitcase and checked out of the hotel just after 7. The clerk asked if I needed a receipt. No, I said. I drove east, no destination planned, just distance. That drive was when the second realization hit me. The trust wasn't designed to protect me. It was designed to remove me. Not from the house, from the situation. Because buried beneath the property language, beneath the clauses about occupancy and authority, was something else entirely. A reporting structure. The trust automatically generated disclosures, not just to attorneys, not just to civil authorities, to agencies that don't show up to mediate disputes. They show up to document patterns. If you've never been the subject of routine review, you don't understand how fast your life can be dissected. Finances, communications, associations, all fair game. I realized then why my son had been so precise, why he insisted on witnesses, why he warned me not to argue. Arguments complicate records. Silence clarifies them. My phone rang as I crossed the state line. Unknown number. I let it ring. Then, again. I pulled over at a rest stop and answered the third call. "Sir," the voice said calmly, "we just want to verify your location." That was all. Not why, not who they were, not what they wanted, just my location. I told them the truth. They thanked me. That's when I knew this was bigger than a family dispute, because no one thanks you unless they already know what they're doing next. I sat in the car for a long time after that call ended, watching people come and go. Families, truckers, a woman arguing quietly with someone on her phone. Ordinary life. All of it happening inches away from a process that had already begun to unwind something carefully hidden. I thought about my son again, about how tired he'd looked in that diner, about how often he'd checked his phone, about the nights he'd come home late and said nothing about why. The trust amendments suddenly made sense. He hadn't been planning for divorce. He'd been planning for exposure. That's the second major truth most people miss. Not all betrayals are personal. Some are strategic. I stopped for coffee a few miles later. The television above the counter was tuned to local news. No mention of the house yet, no footage, but a ticker at the bottom caught my eye. Property irregularities, inquiry expanded. Property irregularities. That's a phrase designed to sound boring. It isn't. It means paperwork didn't line up, ownership wasn't clean, transfers didn't match timelines. It means someone tried to move something they didn't fully control. And here's where the story shifts again. The house wasn't just never legally hers. It had been used, leveraged, referenced in filings that had nothing to do with living arrangements. That was the second plot twist. The house was collateral for something my son didn't agree with and didn't sign off on. I felt sick then, not because of what she'd done, but because of what he must have discovered and who he must have realized was involved. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message. Please do not return to the property. No explanation, just instruction. If you're watching this and thinking you'd push back, ask yourself something honestly. Push back against who? By noon, I was 3 states away, and that's when the first voicemail came through from her. She didn't sound angry anymore. She sounded afraid. She said my name 3 times before she spoke again, like repeating it might anchor her. "They took my things," she said. "They won't tell me what's happening." I didn't return the call. I didn't need to, because fear was finally doing what arguments never could. It was forcing her to ask the right questions, questions she should have asked months earlier. Later that afternoon, another message arrived, not from her, from a lawyer. Different tone, different urgency. "We need to speak with you regarding documents signed by your son." That was the moment I understood the third layer of what he'd done. The trust didn't just shield assets, it created a timeline, one that made it very clear who knew what and when. And once timelines are established, excuses collapse. If this feels unsettling, that's because it should. Most people think danger announces itself with raised voices and slammed doors. In reality, it arrives with calm phone calls and polite requests. And by the time you realize you're part of the picture is already complete. In the next chapter, I'll explain what the lawyer found when they started pulling records, not the ones she expected, the ones that tied her decisions to something far more serious than eviction. Because losing a house is painful, but losing protection, that's permanent. If you believe paperwork can't ruin lives, stay with me. This is where that belief falls apart. The lawyer didn't call again. He sent an email. Short, formal, careful. The kind of message people write when they don't want their tone remembered later. We've identified discrepancies. We need to meet in person. No attachments, no details, just urgency. If you've lived long enough, you learn that real trouble doesn't announce itself loudly. It clears its throat and waits for you to notice. I met them the next morning in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. 2 attorneys, 1 investigator. No small talk. They slid a folder across the table. Thicker than mine. This one didn't contain trust language. It contained patterns, bank statements, email logs, signatures that didn't quite match. One of the attorneys spoke carefully. "Your son didn't sign some of these documents." I didn't respond. I was looking at the dates, because the dates told a different story than the signatures. These weren't last-minute decisions. They weren't panicked moves after a sudden death. They were deliberate, spread out, planned. If someone signed your name without permission, would you assume it was a mistake or a strategy? That question sat heavy in the room. The investigator leaned forward. "The property wasn't just collateral," he said. "It was leverage." Leverage. That word has weight when it's used correctly. They explained that the house had been referenced in filings tied to financial obligations my son had refused to authorize. When those filings were questioned, follow-up documents appeared. Documents that looked legitimate until someone compared handwriting, until someone checked timestamps, until someone noticed my son was in a different state on the days some signatures were supposedly executed. This is the third plot twist most people don't see coming. My son wasn't just protecting me, he was protecting himself from something he'd already discovered. I felt cold then, not afraid, focused. "Who else knew?" I asked. They didn't answer right away. That pause told me everything. More people than I wanted. "Some transactions routed through intermediaries," one attorney said, "which complicates accountability." Complicates accountability. That's a polite way of saying people hide behind distance. If you were watching this unfold, would you still believe this was just a family dispute? Because at that moment, the word widow stopped meaning what it usually does. This wasn't grief-fueled cruelty. This was damage control. The investigator flipped to the last page. He said, "There's another issue." He pointed to a line item tied to the trust, the clause my son highlighted, the one triggered by public threats. That clause didn't just notify authorities, it froze activity. Accounts, assets, pending transfers. Everything stopped, which explained her panic, and explained something else. Why she escalated so fast at the funeral. She wasn't asserting power, she was trying to force movement. Ask yourself this, when people rush, what are they trying to outrun? The attorneys exchanged a look. Your son suspected this would happen. That's why he built in redundancy. Redundancy. He didn't trust one safeguard, he layered them. Because he understood something most people never consider until it's too late. Systems protect systems. People protect themselves. I asked the question I'd been avoiding. Is this criminal? The investigator didn't hesitate. It depends on intent. Intent. That's the word everything hangs on. If intent can be proven, this stops being a paperwork issue. It becomes something else entirely. And intent leaves trails. My phone buzzed during the meeting. A message. From her. Please, we need to talk. This has gone too far. Too far. That phrase fascinates me. People say it when consequences arrive, not when lines are crossed. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because at that moment, I understood why my son had insisted on silence, why he told me not to argue, why he planned for me to disappear from the picture. I wasn't meant to fight. I was meant to survive the fallout. Some people will say I should have warned her. Others will say silence was cruel. Which side are you on? The investigator closed the folder. He said, we're expanding the scope. There are inconsistencies beyond the property. Beyond the property. Beyond the marriage. Beyond what anyone at that funeral understood. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of years press into my knees. They asked if I was all right. I said, I am, but she won't be. That wasn't satisfaction talking. That was certainty. As I left the building, I realized something else. My son hadn't been trying to win. He was trying to end something cleanly. And by shouting at the funeral, she'd done the one thing he warned against. She'd made it public. Public threats create public records, and public records don't care about intentions, tears, or explanations. They care about timelines. In the next chapter, I'll tell you what happened when those timelines reached people who weren't interested in negotiation, people who don't ask for apologies. They ask for compliance. If you think staying quiet never protects you, don't stop here, because silence didn't save her. It exposed her. There's a moment when a situation stops being negotiable. It doesn't come with sirens. It doesn't come with shouting. It comes with paperwork that doesn't ask what you want. The attorneys didn't say much after that meeting. They didn't need to. Their job wasn't to convince me. It was to inform me that things had moved past opinions. 2 days later, I received another message. Not from a lawyer, not from her, from someone who didn't include a title. Your presence is no longer required. Please remain available by phone. That was it. No greeting, no signature. If someone tells you you're no longer required, do you feel relieved or erased? I felt both, because being removed from a process can mean protection, or it can mean you're no longer useful. I stayed where I was, changed hotels, paid cash, didn't give anyone my new address. Not because I was hiding, because I was following instructions that were never written down. The news started breaking in pieces. Not headlines, not breaking alerts, side articles, local segments, buried language. Review ongoing. Clarification pending. No charges at this time. That last one is important. No charges at this time doesn't mean no charges. It means timing matters. If this were happening to you, would you still be sleeping well? My phone rang late that evening. It wasn't her this time. It was an investigator. Different voice, same calm. We need to ask you a few questions, he said. Am I in trouble? I asked. No, he replied. You're not the focus. That sentence carries more weight than most people realize, because when you're not the focus, it means someone else is. He asked about routines, conversations, dates, who was present when documents were discussed. I answered truthfully. Truth is easier to maintain when you haven't tried to shape it. Then he asked something that made me sit down. Did your son ever express concern about retaliation? Retaliation. That word doesn't belong in property disputes. I thought about the diner again, about the promise, about leaving being safer. Yes, I said. He did. There was a pause. Thank you, the investigator said. That helps. Helps who? That's the question people don't ask soon enough. After that call, I didn't hear anything for 12 hours. Silence has a way of stretching time. I watched people in the hotel lobby come and go, laughed at something on their phones, complained about coffee. Normal life. Meanwhile, another life was being dismantled quietly. I found out later that morning when my phone lit up with message after message. Friends of hers, distant relatives, people I hadn't heard from in years, all asking the same thing. What's happening? Do you know why they're asking about the accounts? Is this going to get worse? If people only reach out when they're scared, what does that tell you about what they know? I didn't respond. I wasn't being cruel. I was being accurate, because by then, accuracy mattered more than kindness. The third call that day came from a number I recognized. Her voice sounded different, flat. "They told me not to contact you," she said, "but I don't know who else to talk to." That sentence almost made me laugh. Almost. "They're saying things don't add up," she continued. "They're asking about signatures, about timing." She paused. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Here's the controversial part. I could have answered. I could have explained. I could have softened the fall. Do you believe silence is worse than honesty? Or is honesty sometimes a weapon? "I knew my son planned for this," I said. That was all. She inhaled sharply. "So you let this happen?" "No," I replied. "You did." She hung up. That night, the language in the news changed. Expanded scope, additional review, compliance requested. Those phrases are how systems clear their throats. They're polite warnings. The next morning, something else changed. My phone stopped ringing. No messages, no questions, nothing. If you've never experienced that kind of silence, understand this. It doesn't mean it's over. It means decisions are being made without input. I finally received an update late that afternoon. A single sentence. "Assets temporarily restricted pending determination." Temporarily. Pending determination. That's not punishment. That's containment. Ask yourself honestly, would you still feel in control at that point? Because this is where the power shifts permanently. Not to me, not to her, to systems that don't care who you think you are. And the worst part, the more she tried to explain, the worse it looked. Explanations create inconsistencies. Inconsistencies create patterns. Patterns create conclusions. I realized then that my son had never intended there to be a dramatic showdown. No confrontation, no shouting, just inevitability. The kind you can't talk your way out of. In the next chapter, I'll tell you what happened when those conclusions reached people who don't issue warnings, people who don't negotiate timelines, people who don't care how loud you screamed at a funeral. Some will say what happens next was justice. Others will call it merciless. Decide for yourself, but don't decide yet. Because once you hear how fast everything collapsed, you'll understand why my son never wanted me there to see it. There's a difference between consequences and exposure. Consequences happen quietly. Exposure happens when everyone is allowed to watch. The first sign came early that morning. Not a call, not a message, a notification. A local news alert, one of those generic ones people usually ignore, flashed across my screen. Authorities execute coordinated actions related to ongoing financial review. Coordinated actions, plural. That's when I knew the walls had come down. I turned on the television, different channel this time, same story. Footage of the house. Not from the day police first arrived, but from now. Unmarked vehicles, people in plain clothes carrying boxes, a uniformed officer standing at the curb speaking into a radio. Neighbors gathered again, phones out. This time, no one looked confused. They looked curious. If you've ever watched someone else's life unravel in real time, you know the look. It's not concern. It's relief that it isn't happening to you. Be honest. Would you watch or would you look away? The reporter spoke carefully. No accusations, just facts. Documents, records, items of interest. That language is deliberate. It keeps liability low while letting imagination do the work. Then the camera cut to her. She wasn't in cuffs. That matters. But she wasn't composed either. Hair pulled back hastily, sunglasses too big for her face, jaw clenched so tightly I wondered if it hurt. She tried to walk past the cameras. They followed. That's another thing people misunderstand. Once a story goes public, no one walks away from it alone. A reporter asked a question she didn't answer. Another asked if she denied the allegations. She stopped, just for a second. That pause will follow her forever, because pauses look like guilt to people who don't need proof. If you stopped answering questions, would strangers assume the worst? The story spread fast after that. Not nationally, not yet, but fast enough. Local forums lit up, social feeds, comment sections. People who'd known her for years suddenly remembered things they'd always found odd. That's how public narratives form. Not from evidence, from memory rewriting itself. I didn't comment. I didn't share. I watched. Because watching is safer when you're no longer inside the frame. By mid-morning, the language shifted again. Sources confirm, according to filings, under review for potential escalation. Potential escalation. That's the phrase that makes lawyers go quiet. My phone rang just once that day, a blocked number. I answered. Her voice sounded hollow now, not angry, not pleading, deflated. "They're saying it's bigger than they thought," she said. "They're asking about people I don't even talk to anymore." I said nothing. "You could help," she continued. "You could tell them I didn't mean to." I cut her off. "Meaning stops mattering when patterns appear," I said. "That wasn't cruelty. That was fact." She exhaled slowly, like she was trying not to cry. "They're treating me like I planned this," she said. Here's where some of you will disagree with me. I didn't reassure her. I didn't correct her. Because planning isn't defined by intention. It's defined by repetition. Do you think outcomes matter more than intent? Say it out loud. She hung up without saying goodbye. That afternoon, another update came through. Not flashy, not dramatic, a single sentence buried in an article most people would skim. Additional parties of interest identified. Additional parties, plural again. That's when the scope became undeniable. This wasn't about her alone. It never had been. My son hadn't been isolating himself because of stress. He'd been isolating himself because he'd realized something dangerous. Whatever he discovered wasn't just inconvenient, it was contagious. People involved were already distancing themselves. Lawyers declining comment. Associates suddenly unreachable. Phones going straight to voicemail. That's the sound of a network collapsing. If people disappear when questions start, what does that tell you? By evening, the house was sealed. Not boarded up, not dramatic, just inaccessible. A notice on the door. Official, neutral, final. I thought back to the funeral, to the shouting, to the nods, to the certainty in her voice when she told me to leave. She thought power lived in volume. She was wrong. Power lives in records, and records don't forget. That night, I sat alone and thought about my son, about how calm he'd been when he asked me not to argue, about how precise he'd been when he put things in writing. He wasn't afraid. He'd been finished hoping. There's a difference. Hope waits. Preparation moves. Some will say this collapse was deserved. Others will say it was too much. Where do you stand, right now? Because the story doesn't end here. What happened next didn't involve cameras. It involved decisions. The kind made behind closed doors by people who don't give interviews. People who decide whether something becomes a cautionary tale or a criminal one. In the next chapter, I'll tell you what they decided and why, even after everything you've heard, the most dangerous part of this story still hasn't been resolved. If you think public exposure is the end, don't stop now. It wasn't. There's a point where stories stop belonging to the people in them. They start belonging to records. That point came quietly. No announcement, no press conference, no dramatic knock at the door. Just a decision made somewhere I wasn't invited to. I found out the same way I'd learned everything else in this process, indirectly. A call, short, measured. "The review has concluded," the voice said. "Certain matters will proceed independently." independently. That word carries a particular kind of finality. It means no more explanations are required. No more context will be requested. It means the story, as far as the system is concerned, is complete. If someone told you your role was finished, would you feel relief or dread? I felt both. Because when systems conclude things, they don't do it for emotional reasons. They do it because they've decided what matters. What happened next didn't make headlines. It wouldn't. There was no trial anyone could attend, no verdict people could argue about over dinner. Instead, things disappeared. Accounts went dormant. Names stopped appearing on filings. Properties quietly changed status. Not seized, not sold, restricted. That's a word most people misunderstand. Restriction isn't punishment, it's containment. And containment suggests risk. I received one final message from the attorneys later that week. You won't be contacted again unless necessary. Unless necessary. That phrase stays with you, because it implies the door isn't closed, it's just not being opened right now. I never heard from her again. No apologies, no explanations, no final attempt to rewrite the story. Some people interpret that as guilt. Others see it as survival. Which one do you believe? The house remains empty. That's the detail people always ask about. They expect a new family, a sale, closure. There is none. It sits there unchanged, quiet, untouched, as if the structure itself understands it's no longer safe to occupy. I visit sometimes, not inside. I stand across the street and look at it, not with anger, with distance, because distance is what kept me alive. My son's preparations worked. That's the uncomfortable truth. They worked because he assumed the worst and planned accordingly. Not emotionally, structurally. He didn't trust intentions, he trusted patterns, and patterns don't argue back. I think about the funeral often, about the certainty in her voice when she told me to leave, about the people who nodded, about how convinced everyone was that power was on her side. They weren't wrong, they just misunderstood where power lives. Do you still believe power belongs to the loudest person in the room? Here's the part that makes people uneasy. I don't feel victorious. I don't feel avenged. I feel preserved, which is different. Revenge seeks satisfaction. Preservation seeks survival. And survival rarely looks heroic. Some will say I should have stepped in earlier. Some will say silence made me complicit. Others will argue I did exactly what any reasonable person would do. Which group are you in? Say it plainly. Because here's the unresolved truth I haven't shared yet. The system didn't just close this case, it flagged it. Flagged things don't disappear, they wait. My son understood that. That's why he didn't try to expose everything himself. Exposure invites retaliation. Documentation invites inevitability. And inevitability doesn't care who you are. I still don't know how much he discovered before he died. I don't know how far the connections went. And I don't know whether the silence now means safety or patience. That's the part people struggle with. They want endings. Life doesn't always provide them. Sometimes it provides boundaries instead. Clear ones. I live quietly now. Different routines, different places, different assumptions. I still volunteer, still garden, still watch games on Sundays. But I don't assume proximity equals protection anymore. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. People don't lose everything because they're careless. They lose everything because they trust the wrong silence. If you think this couldn't happen to you, ask yourself, who handles your paperwork? I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't engineer collapse. I stepped aside when something larger than me began to move. And stepping aside is often the most dangerous choice, because it reveals who was standing on borrowed ground. The house remains empty. The records remain. And somewhere, unanswered questions are still being reviewed by people who don't rush. That's not closure. That's containment. And containment is not the end of a story. It's just the point where the story stops asking permission. Some will call this justice. Others will call it cold. Decide where you stand. And if you're still here, still thinking about this long after it ended, there's a reason. Stories like this don't spread because they're entertaining. They spread because they feel possible. If you don't want to be caught unprepared, you already know what to do. And if you disagree with how this ended, say why. I read everything.